It was supposed to be just another normal day at the courthouse. People trickled in, shuffled through metal detectors, and prepared for the proceedings to unfold like they always do. But what happened that morning would shock everyone present and change the course of the day in an instant. The air was thick with tension. As a veteran cop, known for his arrogance and disdain for those he deemed unworthy, entered the courtroom with his coffee in hand. But little did he know, the woman seated at the front calm, poised, and confident was not just any judge. She was a black woman, respected by everyone who knew her. But to this cop, she was just another face in the crowd. The morning seemed routine until a careless mistake made by the cop set everything into motion. As the court session began, something unexpected occurred. The cop, perhaps distracted by his own thoughts, moved with an almost callous disregard for the people around him. In a moment of sheer arrogance, he turned to walk away from the judge's bench, only to swing his arm and spill hot coffee directly into her face. The courtroom fell silent in disbelief. The judge, caught off guard by the hot liquid splashing across her face, froze for a second. For most, this would have been a moment of sheer vulnerability, a chance to panic or lose control. But not her. No, she didn't flinch, didn't break, but her eyes, those sharp eyes, flashed with something far more dangerous than any liquid could cause. There was a fire building in her, a deep, burning fury that nobody in that room could ignore. As she wiped the coffee from her face, the silence in the room only deepened. No one knew how to react. Was this an accident, or had it been done on purpose? The cop stood there, eyes wide, realizing too late what had just happened. He had made a mistake, but more than that, he had made a mistake that could cost him far more than he could have ever imagined. But this was just the beginning, because this judge, this black woman, known for her fair but firm judgments, her unwavering commitment to justice, wasn't going to let something like this slide. She stood up slowly, the room holding its breath. You could see the wheels turning in her mind, each second stretching longer than the last. The cop, still trying to figure out if he should apologize or make an excuse, didn't even realize who he was dealing with. And that was the fatal flaw in his thinking. He had no idea who she was. But soon he would learn. The judge stood there for what felt like an eternity, the courtroom completely still, everyone's eyes fixed on her. The cop, still gripping his coffee cup like it might somehow fix the situation, shifted his weight nervously. The room was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the first move, to show any sign of reaction. But there was nothing. She wiped her face, her movements slow and deliberate. No one had seen her flinch, not even when the hot liquid hit her. In fact, if you didn't know her, you might have missed it entirely. The subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her fists curled just slightly, just enough to show she was not as unshaken as she appeared. But those who had worked with her knew better. This wasn't the first time she'd had to face disrespect. This wasn't the first time she'd had to walk into a room where people underestimated her, wrote her off as just another black woman in a position of power, and it sure wasn't going to be the last. For years, Judge Victoria Adams had fought for a seat at the table in the criminal justice system, a system that, time and time again, made it clear that it wasn't built for people like her. She had earned her position through grit, determination, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. And while many saw her as a beacon of hope in the community, others saw her as a threat symbol of change that was slowly but surely breaking down long-standing barriers. The cop who had just thrown hot coffee in her face, he was one of those who saw her as a threat. He had been on the force for years, a veteran with a reputation for being tough, for not taking crap from anyone. And to him, this courtroom was just another space where power dynamics played out, where people knew their place. But Victoria wasn't about to play by the same rules he had learned. She had spent her entire career fighting against people like him, the ones who assumed their privilege was a right, who thought they could walk all over anyone they deemed less worthy. As the judge wiped the coffee from her face, the cop finally spoke, his voice shaky but defensive. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I didn't mean..." His words hung in the air, but there was no mistaking the arrogance behind them. It wasn't the apology that mattered. It was the fact that he hadn't seen the consequences of his actions until now. He had no idea who she really was, what she was capable of, and what his recklessness had just unleashed. Victoria, her voice steady, but carrying an edge of steel, finally broke the silence. You think your apology makes this go away? Her words cut through the room, and for the first time, the cop took a step back, his bravado crumbling. The room had begun to feel charged, the energy thick with tension. People could sense something big was about to happen. Her voice was firm, but controlled as she continued. You may not have known who I am, but let me make it clear. I will not tolerate disrespect. Not from anyone. Not in this courtroom. Not in my presence. Your actions have consequences. And today, you'll learn exactly what those consequences are. As Victoria spoke, the cop's face turned pale. This wasn't the first time someone had disrespected her, but it was the first time someone had so blatantly underestimated her. He had no idea who he was up against. This wasn't just about spilled coffee anymore. It wasn't just about an apology. This was personal now, for both of them. As the cop stumbled for words, his face a mix of confusion and shame, Victoria's thoughts were racing. She had spent years in the trenches of the justice system, and she knew all too well the subtle ways that power dynamics worked to keep people like her in check. This wasn't about an accident. It was a reminder, a glaring one, of how far people would go to maintain control. And the cop had crossed a line. The line was drawn, and there was no going back. As the courtroom waited for her to make her move, the camera zoomed in on the judge's face calm, but something was building in her eyes. She had dealt with worse, much worse. But today, in this moment, this man had pushed her too far. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers, but Victoria stayed still, her gaze never leaving the cop. And then, with a finality that sent a chill through the room, she spoke again. You want to be a hero? She asked, her voice cutting through the murmurs. You want to be the one who gets respect? Then start by showing some. To everyone. I won't let you tarnish the work I've done and the work of everyone who fought for a fair system. The cop's face reddened, and his eyes flickered. He had been trained to handle difficult situations, but this was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. This wasn't a suspect on the street. This wasn't a criminal to be subdued. This was a woman, a judge, who had already seen everything this world could throw at her, and she was still standing. Victoria didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she turned toward the bailiff. Remove him from the courtroom. Now. The tension in the room escalated. People could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The cop, now realizing the depth of his mistake, opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. As the bailiff stepped forward, his hand on the cop's arm, he knew that this moment would follow him for the rest of his career. What had started as a careless mistake was now spiraling into something much bigger, and the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. But what no one knew, not even the cop, was that Judge Victoria Adams wasn't done. Not by a long shot. What she had just started would make waves far beyond this courtroom. It would send a message, and no one, especially not this cop, would be able to ignore it. As the cop was escorted out, the room was left in stunned silence, the weight of the moment settling in on everyone present. But the story was far from over. The battle for respect, for justice, had only just begun, and no one knew what Victoria Adams would do next. As the cop was escorted out of the courtroom, the tension in the air remained thick, but Victoria didn't let it overwhelm her. She wasn't finished. In fact, the events that had just unfolded were only the beginning of something much larger, something that would ripple through the system and change the way people viewed Herond, the way they viewed justice. The courtroom sat in uneasy silence, everyone waiting for her next move. The bailiff returned to his position, and the jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge stood tall, her back straight, her expression calm but intense. She hadn't just stood up for herself today, she'd stood up for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, and disrespected because of the colour of their skin, their gender, or their position. But it wasn't just about the cop anymore. It was about creating change. Real change. Victoria cleared her throat, her voice breaking the silence with clarity. This court will not tolerate the kind of behavior that disrespects the dignity of anyone, no matter their rank, no matter their position. Not today. Not ever. This is my courtroom, and we will do things the right way, with fairness and respect. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time that day, the weight of the situation hit everyone. The cops' actions had shaken the courtroom, but they had also lit a spark. Victoria's actions, refusal to let the moment slide, her commitment to holding people accountable were a call to everyone present to stand up for what's right, to stop letting the small acts of disrespect slide, to stop letting the powerful think they could get away with things just because of who they were. Word spread fast. The incident didn't stay in the courtroom. It traveled across news outlets, social media, and eventually, the streets. The story of the racist cop and the black judge became the talk of the town. It wasn't just about a heated courtroom moment anymore. It was about a larger truth being exposed. Victoria's refusal to back down made people start questioning the very systems that had allowed this kind of behavior to continue unchecked. And then came the surprise. A few days after the incident, the police department made an official statement. They were conducting an internal investigation. The cop would be suspended pending the results. But it wasn't just that. Victoria was asked to address the issue in front of the public, something that had never happened before in such a high-profile case. She agreed, but on her own terms. In a press conference that caught the attention of people across the country, Judge Victoria Adams stood before the cameras, no longer just a figure in the courtroom, but a beacon of justice. "This is not about one man," she began, her voice unwavering. "This is about a system that allows people to think they can get away with disrespecting others, simply because of their position or the color of their skin. We must hold ourselves to a higher standard. We must demand better from each other. We must ensure that justice is served not just for the people in front of us, but for everyone." The press conference was a turning point. The cops' actions, while a catalyst, had sparked something bigger, something that was already changing the conversation around justice, race, and accountability. It was no longer just about an incident in a courtroom. It was about a movement. In the weeks that followed, as the investigation into the cop continued, the courtroom buzzed with a different energy. Lawyers, judges, and even jury members came up to Victoria, thanking her for standing firm. Her decision to not back down had created a ripple effect, one that reached beyond that one moment and into the hearts of people who had long felt powerless. And the cop? He faced the consequences of his actions. He was ultimately fired, his career tarnished, and his reputation forever stained by the day he underestimated a black woman in power. Victoria's story didn't end there, though. The spotlight on her intensified, but she didn't change. She remained as focused and committed as ever to her work. She continued to push for a fairer, more just system where respect wasn't a privilege, but a right. As time passed, people began to reflect on the deeper message Victoria's actions carried, that real change starts with standing up, even when it seems like no one is watching. That sometimes, one moment of courage, one refusal to stay silent, can spark a wave of transformation. And that justice, true justice, doesn't just serve the few, it serves everyone. Victoria had proven something that day. She had proven that power doesn't always lie in the hands of those who think they control it. True power lies in the hands of those who refuse to be silenced. And in that courtroom, on that day, Judge Victoria Adams had shown exactly that. She wasn't just a judge. She was a force of change. And she wasn't done yet. As the months passed, her legacy grew, not just as a judge, but as a symbol of strength and justice. And the world, slowly but surely, started to see her and people like her not as a threat, but as the change they so desperately needed.